Okay, Scott, I'll tell you, Professor Scott, and then when
the slides are in Portuguese.
I introduce you,
so
I will let you know. Please, Professor Scott, and then you start.
Okay.
Okay, Scott.
Okay.
Boa tarde, é comigo, se é comigo. Slovic. Kumar. Professor Scott também foi presidente fundador da ASLE nos anos 90 e muitos anos como editor da ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment. Professor Scott, it's such an honor to have you here. Please.
Thank you very much, Zelia, for the introduction and the invitation to speak at this conference. I hope the technology will not fail us and we'll somehow manage to present these slides. And I see that you have the slides in Portuguese on the screen. I'm also on my very small computer screen looking at the English slides, which I'll use for my presentation. So if we can move to the next slide, please, the abstract. You can see that oh, you have it in English. I thought you had it translated it into Portuguese. So I'm going to, in this talk, offer a brief introduction to humanities-based plant studies or critical plant studies, which I began working in a few years ago, essentially moving into this field almost by accident when asked to edit a special issue of an Italian journal called Lagoonscapes, the Venice Journal of Environmental Humanities. So in 2023, or 2022, I co-edited this special issue devoted to tree-related eco-criticism, or a subfield within critical plant studies. And I would like in my talk today to give an overview of not just critical plant studies in general, but more specifically tree-related eco-criticism, and then offer you a short example, a case study of my particular analysis of a short story that I found rather interesting, an example of tree-related literary fiction, more specifically science fiction. And let me apologize to any people who've heard me give other versions of this lecture before. I've offered it in a few different places around the world, but I thought it might be interesting to talk about plants for this particular group associated with ASLE Brazil, because there's a lot of potential for critical plant studies in Brazil or in Brazilian humanities scholarship. And this lecture might encourage some more of that. So next slide, please. Well, Nalini Nadkarni is a biologist and an ecological communicator with a particular interest in trees. Her research field is forest canopy. And so she's fascinated by the upper branches of trees. And she wrote this very powerful book about the importance of trees in human life called Between Earth and Sky, Our Intimate Connections to Trees, in which she suggests that trees of all the entire plant world, trees have particular power and importance for human beings, a kind of symbolism and an attachment that we have with them. And she argues that we should do our best to protect forests and protect trees, and that every individual, each one of us, has a role to play. And what I would like to suggest is that even a young literary artist, like the author I will be talking about in my key example in this lecture, John Jakes, and then an eco-critic like me, and maybe other eco-critics among us who are especially interested in trees, almost a century later, we also have a role to play in our daily lives and in our scholarship to support the protection of trees. Next slide. So for the 2022 special issue of the new Italian journal, Lagoonscapes, my Taiwanese colleague, Serena Zhou, and I decided we would focus on plants because Serena is especially interested in farming and food and literature, and trees seemed like an interesting extension of her work on eco-critical agricultural studies. We leaned heavily on the work of an American colleague who lived for many years in Australia, named John C. Ryan, who's done quite a few different books on plants in general, such as The Language of Plants, Forest Family, Seeing Trees, and The Mind of Plants. Those are just a few of his plant-related books. And we used Ryan's work as an important theoretical foundation for our own special issue of this journal. Next slide. And we suggested that in addition to dividing eco-criticism into many subfields such as plant studies, a further division of eco-criticism would be the specific focus on the cultural meanings and textual representations of trees. And we mentioned a few books that have emphasized the special place of trees and also the absence of trees. What does it mean when we have no trees in the human imagination? And trees have been important throughout human history, but especially during an era of changing climate and deforestation caused by the desertification or spreading aridity resulting from climate change, terrible and destructive new storm patterns, wildfire seasons, and ongoing tree cutting industries. People find themselves especially interested in the meaning of trees in our lives with more intensity, more acuteness, and with more nostalgia than ever before. So I think there's a special resurgence of interest in trees at this particular time in history. Next slide. So our goal in the special issue from 2022 was to offer a sample from around the world, from Australia, Morocco, India, Turkey, France, Taiwan, and also North America. We don't have any examples in this special issue from South America, but we very easily could have included some examples of tree literature and tree criticism from a place like Brazil. And so I guess I would encourage all of you who are doing eco-critical work in Brazil to consider how you might write about trees in Brazilian culture, or maybe bring some ideas about the meaning of trees from Brazilian culture into the analysis of tree-related texts, not only literary texts, but perhaps work in other media or genres. Next slide. And so what we ultimately were aiming to suggest in this special issue of the journal Lagoonscapes is that many of us are not only concerned about protecting nature in general, And we would use in English a word like tree huggers to describe people who are especially fond of nature and concerned about nature. We are not only tree huggers, but tree thinkers. We bring our imaginations and our critical thinking skills to the study of tree-related texts in doing arboreal eco-criticism. And there's a picture of me here on this slide hugging a tree here in Oregon, where I live. Actually, at the moment, I'm working on a new article focusing on touching trees, not just interest in trees in general, but the meaning of the physical touching of trees, hugging trees, putting our hands on trees, and other extensions of what the theorist Bell Hooks calls touching the earth. What does it mean to have physical contact with the earth as a way of reassuring us that the earth is still alive and present in our lives, and also encouraging us to do our best to protect the world that we live in? So I'm just beginning to think specifically about touch and hugging and other forms of physical interaction with the plant world. And so this notion of tree hugging is something very much on my mind at the moment. Next slide. So we covered a lot of different subjects in the special issue, but I'm going to talk about three of my favorite examples. And one of them is from Françoise Besson, who I believe is attending the lecture this morning and will be speaking to you tomorrow. But I just want to give a brief overview of these three examples of tree-related eco-criticism that I thought were useful contributions to this special journal issue. Next slide. Next slide, please. So the first example is by John Ryan, whom I mentioned earlier, a very important scholar of plant-related humanities research, or critical plant studies. So we called the field of tree-related eco-criticism arboreal eco-criticism, but John Ryan refers to it as dendro-criticism, dendro being another word for tree. And or as he puts it, tree-focused environmental, literary, and cultural analysis. So arboreal eco-criticism, dendro-criticism mean essentially the same thing. And he uses various examples of Australian poetry because he lived for many years in Australia. And several of these are from Aboriginal Australian writers, specifically related to one kind of tree called the boab tree, which is especially meaningful in Australian culture. And he's especially interested in the story of one boab tree whose name is Gija Jumulu. So the tree actually has a tree, and it was actually dug up from the ground and transplanted or relocated 2,000 miles or more than 3,000 kilometers across Australia and replanted in a different place. And you might think, well, that's actually a very gentle and generous thing to do, to not simply to cut down a tree, but to transplant it and keep it alive. But in referring to texts such as Veronica Lake's 2012 poem, Boab Tree, John Ryan says it's actually rather damaging to the spirit of this particular tree to move it from the place where it had lived. Next slide. Yeah, these are just the critical terms that he uses. And it's especially interesting to me, the story of the displacement of a tree. And one of the reasons why this is such an interesting idea is that the poets that Ryan is discussing have the notion that the tree is intelligent, conscious, sensitive to where it is placed in the world. And by the way, this is a picture of a boab tree, very unusual looking tree with its huge base and then tapered, slender upper canopy. Next slide. So let's see, here is an overview of dendrocritical practice, where he says it seeks to understand the complexities of arboreality, meaning treeness, the complexities of treeness, beyond simply being used as a superficial, next slide, or the previous slide, please. The slide before, please. No, backward. Go back, please. There you go. That's good. So rather than simply looking at trees as a projection of human desire, he argues that dendrocriticism, or tree-related eco-criticism, tries to appreciate the voice of the tree. They're not voiceless. They have a voice. They have a consciousness and an intelligence, and as well as a physicality, a corporeal existence that is meaningful. They have more than a textual function. Next slide. So he refers to Veronica Lake's poem, Boab Tree, which evokes empathy for this ancient tree, Gija Jumalu, that was relocated some 3,000 kilometers in 2008. And let me see, I'm trying to look at a version of the slide that I can read. The poem quotes the tree speaking to say, "I've been ripped from my heart place, moved south into exile to soil that chills my soul." In Australia, when you go further south, you're moving away from the equator to a colder climate. So to remove a boab tree from the warm soil of the north to the chilly soil of the south is to reinforce the fact that the boab tree is not in its home territory, and in fact to suggest that it is an emotional struggle for such a tree to be removed from the place where it belongs. And so as Ryan says, Veronica Lake evokes empathy for the ancient tree as a percipient individual, a perceptive, sensitive individual, which is a rather radical way to think of a tree, not just as a member of a group with no feeling, with nothing resembling a human consciousness. So this is an example of what dendrocriticism might achieve to help us care about and gain a sense of deeper understanding for an individual tree that is in a way suffering from removal, or relocation from its native place. Next slide. So he also writes about Bill Nyeji, a very prominent Aboriginal poet in Australia, who 20 years before Veronica Lake's poem imagined the consciousness of a tree. In a 12-section poem called Tree, Nyeji reflects on what happens when you remove trees, either transplant them or cut them down in order for human progress, to build buildings or build a road. And in this little passage quoted here from Nyeji, he actually attributes consciousness and a human-like identity to the tree. Sometimes you have to knock them down, to do things that people need to do. And then you might say to yourself, well, he's all right. Doesn't matter that you cut it down, he being the tree, because we need that road. So he's using what John Ryan calls radically inclusive pronoun to write about the tree as a he, as if it were a human being, to suggest what happens when you remove trees just because human beings need to build what they need to build. And it's a criticism of this attitude toward removing trees, but also an appreciation of kind of a human identification or sense of kinship with trees, as if they were like ourselves. Next slide, please. Another contributor to this special journal issue was Marianne Maroum from Lebanon, who was writing about Arabic language tree literature, specifically focusing on a writer named Mohammed Al-Zafzaf, a very prominent writer from Morocco in North Africa, and looking at his short story called The Sacred Tree. Her approach is very different than John Ryan's reading of Australian Aboriginal tree literature. She's interested in the social, political, and religious political constructions or intellectual constructions that surround the idea of sacred trees and cutting down trees, which is a decision sometimes taken by government officials who are not acting out of a kind of religious idea of the sacred. And so she's interested in the tension between the sacred and the profane practical reasons for sometimes cutting down trees, and the sacred reason, the spiritual reason for protecting a tree that might have a lot of meaning for a particular community. And so in this particular story by Al-Zafzaf, the author believes that the religious respect for trees is outdated and superstitious, and controlling more conservative traditional members of society. And sometimes for the sake of progress, it's necessary to move forward and cut down trees. This is a realistic notion of how human communities think about trees. Some people being detached, other people being deeply attached. So next slide, please. Next slide is just an overview of the contemplation of the sacred, the superstitious, and the profane in the context of tree felling, and the relationship between the public or the populace and official authorities. Next slide, please. So in her article, Maroum writes about, she doesn't use arboreal eco-criticism or dendrocriticism. She uses the term arboriculture or tree culture, which she takes from the book Tree Cultures, The Place of Trees and Trees in Their Place, from Owen Jones and Paul Cloak, a 2002 book, which says that arboriculture looks at the many different or myriad social constructions positioning trees in a community or in a society as anything from sources of timber, sources of wood, to living spirits, a huge range of human relationships to trees. And so the short story, The Sacred Tree, reveals interesting things about members of the same community who have very different ways of appreciating the meaning of a tree, and they all have a certain legitimacy, although some may seem destructive and others protective. Next slide, please. So, previous slide, the slide before. I think I need this. There, good. So Françoise is with us today, and she will also be giving a talk tomorrow. And one of the things I particularly like about her contribution to the lagoonscapes issue, in which she writes about the French text, Jean Genot's the man who planted trees, is her interest in this one gesture, one particular type of human gesture of tree planting. And so much of what we think about when we imagine human actions in relation to trees is destructive. Using a saw or an axe to cut down a tree or an entire forest. The counter gesture, the opposite gesture, is to lean down to the ground and physically place a small tree into the ground as a tree planter. And so this is the meaning of, or the key action within John Jono's famous book, that one human being can perform this simple physical gesture of placing a small tree into the ground again and again and again in order to turn a desert back into a rich and fertile forest. And this is important not only in itself, but as a symbol for the healing power of certain human gestures with regard to the natural world. Next slide. So Françoise is interested in this notion of causing global change or working toward global change through local gestures. The idea of a healing gesture, which is a very positive way of thinking about the human relationship to trees and the larger natural world. Actually, the cover of this particular edition of The Man Who Planted Trees, I think, is especially beautiful because it shows a person's hand placing a small tree into the ground, literally demonstrating that gesture. Next slide. Oh, I see. Actually, we've lost the slides.
Yeah,
but
it's amazing.
What, Zelia?
I can't see the slides from here, too.
Yeah, I know.
Please
You can? Okay.
go.
I don't see the slides, but I'll just continue anyway. Anyway, the Françoise Besson's article for that special issue focuses on French literature and this one famous example of tree literature emphasizing the gesture that leads to transforming a desert into a beautiful, fertile land. So now I'd like to jump ahead and talk a little bit about this short story by an American writer named John Jakes. And again, I apologize to those who've heard me discuss this text in the past, but those of you who don't know it may find it interesting. I found this by accident when I was asked to give a lecture on science fiction and eco-criticism a few years ago. Just found it on the internet. I had heard of John Jakes, but never as an environmental writer. And when I found this short science fiction text published in November 1950 in a science fiction magazine, it seemed like a great work to think about from an eco-critical point of view. John Jakes was born in 1923, and he just died a few months before I began lecturing on his story. I had never interacted with him, hadn't known very much about him, but he was 90 years old at his death and was a best-selling author who wrote historical fiction and fantasies, mysteries, westerns set out in with the pioneers of the American West. He sold many millions of books. In fact, entire forests were cut down in order to make the books that he sold. So it's ironic that the first story that he may have published, this story from 1950, when he was only 18 years old, was about protecting trees and protecting forests. The story is called The Dreaming Trees, and it's about a character named Alma Ward, a woman who's come to a new planet in space on a rocket ship in order to determine whether to say yes or no to cutting down an unusual forest called the Dreaming Trees. And there's another character named Ben Thorson, or Mr. Thorson, who's trying to protect the trees and is pleading with Alma, please don't cut down these trees. They're special. You should not cut them down for human progress. So what the key aspect of the story is that the trees are conscious. The trees seem to be alive in a way beyond our usual way of thinking of trees. And John Jakes uses various kinds of phrasing to emphasize the sentience or the consciousness of the trees. He says they nourish themselves, they manufacture food by plant methods, but they have a nervous system and what amounts to a spinal cord and a brain of the kind found in higher animals. They, the trees, think. And how we know that they think, or how the character Ben Thorson knows that they think, is that they use language. So this is a work of science fiction. So the character Thorson actually has a little box on his belt, which enables him to communicate with the trees. Yeah, you can keep advancing the slides. I'll tell you when to stop. A little bit more, a little bit more. A few more slides, please. A few more slides. A few more. One more. One more. Back one slide. The trees are human. The trees are human, or at least feeling sentient beings. And so the character Ben Thorson, who's protecting the forest, has a little tool, a technology attached to his belt that enables that translates his own speech into tree speech, and then interprets the tree sounds, the rustling of their leaves, into speech that Thorson can understand. So, and because he can communicate with the trees, he knows they're conscious, and language ability is this evidence of sentience. And he says, the trees are human, or at least feeling sentient beings. You can't kill something like that ruthlessly. It's the consciousness and language abilities of the trees that inspires the character in this story to say that you can't kill the trees. You can't cut them down. You must protect the forest. Next slide. In the table of contents for the special issue of the magazine, this science fiction magazine, where it says the dreaming trees, the line under the title is, the trees were an obstacle to progress on the planet, but destroying them would be murder. Destroying them would be murder, just as it would be murder to kill human beings. So sentience and language abilities are evidence of the meaning of the tree lives, which makes it immoral to cut them down. Next slide. So despite the fact that the trees are conscious, they're like human beings, in this short story, Jakes also says that the wood is very beautiful. If you cut out a cube of wood, a piece of wood, it changes colors in a very beautiful way. So it's possible to harvest little pieces of the trees and make money from them without destroying the trees completely. So ironically, although he appreciates the trees as sentient human-like beings, Thorson also has a commercial relationship with them, injecting an anesthetic, a painkiller into them, taking small blocks out, and making money. But he argues that this procedure actually facilitates growth. It helps the trees grow in a strange way. So it's not destructive to them, he claims. Next slide. So there's also a kind of romantic element in the story between the character Alma whose goal is to find new planets for humans to inhabit, and Thorson, who's a local person on this planet with the dreaming trees, and whose job is to protect the trees. Ultimately, Alma is persuaded to not make a decision until Thorson is able to put a protective shield or force field over the entire forest. And Thorson will stay inside with the trees while Alma continues to explore other planets, looking for places for humans to move. Next slide, please. Let's see. Well, in the end, Thorson vows, the character Thorson vows to stay with his trees, his dream of belonging with the trees and protecting the trees, because he knew that his dream was right, the dream of being a protector of trees and not having this forest cut down for the sake of humans. Next slide. Oh yeah, so here, the phrase "the dreaming trees" is rather interesting. The trees themselves can think, they can dream. That's one meaning of the title of the story. Also, Thorson dreams that the character Alma will one day return to him from her exploration of space. The third possible meaning that I came up with is he knew that his dream was right and would be accepted eventually by people in general. So the hope for more enlightened human thinking about trees sometime in the future. And then also the author himself seems to be envisioning or dreaming of a future time when humanity will be more enlightened toward the natural world in general. And this is often the case of science fiction. It imagines a time in the future when people will think in a different way in order to guide us in that direction. Next slide, please. So, next slide. Indeed, you may be aware that there's been a kind of renaissance of tree-related literature, particularly in nonfiction, but also in some cases fiction, concerned with the intelligence of trees. One example is the 2021 book by forest scientist from British Columbia, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest, where this scientist is referring to this notion of the giant mother tree, the tree that is a central member of a community that protects all the other trees in the forest by communicating with them, by offering nourishment, and by displaying a kind of intelligence or sentience that enables the mother tree to protect all the other trees. They convey warning messages, recognition messages, safety dispatches, almost like telephone calls. They interact with each other as if they have civil societies resembling human societies. This is the argument in Susan Simard's book. That's just one example. And after this, if we could go to the next slide, let me just say a word about science fiction and the style of writing that Jakes was writing in. I'm almost finished. This is a very abbreviated version of the lecture, but Jerry Canavan, in the book that he and Kim Stanley Robinson edited called Green Planets, Ecology and Science Fiction, says some things that are highly relevant, certainly to the John Jakes story, but I think also to other kinds of science fiction texts with ecological meaning. Canavan refers to the theorist Darko Suvin's essay on the poetics of the science fiction genre, where Suvin says that estrangement or removal of science fiction from ordinary human life in the present and on this planet, the estrangement is disorienting and defamiliarizing. of the conditions of our everyday life, which opens our minds to previously unimagined possibilities. Suveen says, the alienated view from outside offered by cognitive estrangement allows us to examine ourselves and our institutions, such as our tendency to cut down forests and abuse individual trees, in an unflattering light. We can be more critical of who we are and the way we think about the world if we see such thinking presented in an estranged way, in a distant place or distant time. And that's exactly what John Jakes offers us in his story, The Dreaming Trees. Next slide. So Canavan also writes about the need to transition from a cowboy economy of unlimited resources to a spaceship economy of conservation and mindful avoidance of wasting natural resources. So this is, according to Canavan, a frequent tendency in science fiction literature that fits very well with the goals of eco-criticism. Because if you think about it, a lot of science fiction occurs on spaceships, on other planets, where the human or human-like characters have limited resources available to them. So they are learning to think according to a spaceship economy, which is to a great extent what we need to understand in our own lives on Earth if we're to avoid being overly destructive. Next slide, please. I wanted also to mention to you this interesting book from 2021 by Michael Gormley called The End of the Anthropocene, Eco-Criticism, the Universal Ecosystem, and the Astropocene. So he's saying we're actually at a stage where we're moving beyond the Anthropocene of humans affecting the physical nature of the Earth and beginning to think about the ecological implications of human lives in other parts of the universe. And he writes about various literary examples that explore human life in space, such as the Andy Weir novel, The Martian, which has a human character named Mark Watney living on Mars, and as part of an advanced space exploration party. And so the notion of the planetary survival genre is closely related to the spaceship economy, learning to survive with limited resources, which may actually be where we end up being on this Earth if we're not careful and if we're overly destructive. As I move toward the end of my talk, let me just briefly refer to next slide, a couple more interesting examples of arboreal eco-criticism, such as the 2021 scholarly collection by Carmen Concilio and Daniela Fardione, Trees in Literature and the Arts, Human Arboreal Perspectives in the Anthropocene, which highlights this notion of the fundamental kinship between trees and humans, where they write in the introduction, trees and us are related, are thinkable within a kinship, which to me is one of the more profound and essential dimensions of not all arboreal eco-criticism, but a lot of arboreal eco-criticism, which highlights this deep emotional and physical bond between humans and trees. And the two editors say that this book is a way of creating and promoting an intertwined multiple dialogue, acknowledging the presence of trees all around us, with us, the role of trees in our lives or in the existence of the protagonists of the stories we read, study, teach, and love best. Trees in their real and symbolic functions on our planet Earth. So a very, very profound philosophical and I think heartfelt exploration of our relationships with trees. Next slide. yeah, so again, they talk about tree hugging too as a respond to a call of relationality. We hug a tree and we also hug the tree's relations with the sun that heats it, the wind that blows through its foliage, the ice in winter that freezes the soil around its base, the colony of insects and bacteria that find refuge in it. When we hug a tree, or even when we simply put our hand on a tree, we are coming into contact with a whole community of other creatures, a new kinship of human arboreal connections. And so I find this really fascinating, what we might learn from the experience of coming into physical contact with trees. Um, Next slide. And let's skip a few slides. Next slide, please. Next one after that. So one example, a particularly interesting chapter in the Trees in Literature and Arts collection is the chapter by Alberto Baracco about an Italian filmmaker named Cosimo Terlizzi, and in particular looking at a 2018 film called Day, or Gods, um, which is a somewhat poetic and surrealistic film style about the relationship between a family and one olive tree on their property. There's a still photo from the film Day of one of the characters, and it looks like a dog underneath the tree. And he's interested in how this filmmaker's work show the um, elusiveness, or the problems with human desire for domination of nature, and reveal a deep concern for the disavowal of the sacred original relationship that binds us to the earth and other living beings. So what happens when we don't feel that bond? When we disavow or separate ourselves from the notion of a sacred original relationship that truly binds us to the earth. So next slide. Next slide, please. Let me see. So in this particular film, I'm kind of jumping ahead here to finish quickly. He's interested in the symbolic final scene of the film Day that shows us the relationship linking the olive tree with the human characters, because the tree is diseased, it's not healthy, and the family decides that they must remove it. Also, one of the brother of one particular character, Martino, the key character in the film, the brother has died, and the family's reaction to the cutting down of the tree is very similar to their reaction to losing a human family member. So after they cut down the tree and they're removing the parts of the tree, the final images of the film show the main character, Martino, driving behind the tree on his motor scooter, and it's a very deeply sad, symbolic final scene showing what Baracco calls a lacerating, a cutting, irreparable loss. And the loss of the tree is just as emotionally cutting and painful as the loss of a human family member. So I find that it's a dark and disturbing and a sad scene, but it also shows the profound sense of of kinship, like a family relationship that these people have with their tree. If we can, I have two more slides. If we can just jump to the next one, please. On a more positive note, oh wait, oh no, one slide back, please. Previous slide. The previous slide. I have it on my screen separately. I wanted to talk briefly about Andy Brown's recent book, which it's closely related to what I'm working on right now, and tree hugging, tree touching, tree climbing. His book is called The Tree Climbing Cure, and he actually has a chapter late in this book on tree hugging specifically. And he's interested in the positive relationship of trees to human health. He calls them a cure. This is Andy Brown is a British scholar from the UK, and this is related to the well-known idea of the nature cure, which a lot of British writers have been talking about in recent years. And he's more specifically interested in tree climbing up in the branches of trees as a way of curing human problems. He says in his introduction, people often climb trees at times of decision making or crisis, like what do I do in my life? Well, let me climb a tree and maybe some clarity will come to my thinking. So decision making, psychological distress, conflict, protest, family breakdown and rebellion, or for simple recreation, pleasure seeking, freedom seeking, spiritual quest, childish regress, or simply taking some adventurous exercise. A lot of reasons that are good for the human mind to be climbing up in trees. Sadly, I found years ago when I was doing a lot of teaching with my students out in the wilderness, and I would ask them to climb trees occasionally as part of our class, many of my young students had not climbed trees before. It seems to be a less popular thing to do for young people than it was when I was young. And I think they're missing the opportunity to feel this close interaction with another being, with trees. So next slide, final slide, please. So critical plant studies and even arboreal eco-criticism are very large and growing fields that cover many different aspects of human relationships with plants. So I tried to offer a brief introduction to this today and to suggest that eco-critical plant studies is a global scholarly movement. So I mentioned various countries in my talk today. I didn't mention Brazil because I'm not aware of arboreal eco-criticism in Brazil, but I think there must be many interesting opportunities to expand this field to Brazil. And I find it interesting that there's a potential conversion between a bringing together of arboreal eco-criticism and eco-critical science fiction studies in works like John Jake's The Dreaming Trees that explore our relationships with other species on this planet and possibly other planets, and likely in future times, not in our present time. And also the way science fiction helps to remove us or estrange us from our ordinary experience in order to enable us to look at ourselves and our planet in a more detached and clear-eyed way. So I think there's a lot of potential for future work in both arboreal eco-criticism and eco-critical science fiction studies. So thank you for your attention. I hope you'll enjoy the other lectures in this conference. And that's the end. We can stop sharing the screen at this point.
No, but okay, Professor, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. And just a brief comment on our relationship with trees. I think that we usually emphasize the relationship between humans and trees because we have plenty of trees and plenty of problems as the devastation of the Amazon. And of course, we have to find out a way to explore and to comment about this. Thank you, Professor. And you guys are invited to go to the next meeting.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.